All right, thank you for coming tonight. To open our forum, I'd like to invite Carolyn Iena to provide an acknowledgement of country. Carolyn is a Wiradjuri person, rapper and activist, and a member of Action for Public Housing and Hands Off Glebe. She has led the campaign to save 82 Wentworth Park Road, where they have lived for 30 years. They are now being forced to move so that the New South Wales Land and Housing Corporation can demolish and redevelop the complex. Jane. Carolyn will open the forum by sharing their experience living at 82 Wentworth Park Road and provide an acknowledgement of country. Please welcome Carolyn.
Yiridu Marang, Yuwindu Carolyn, Nadu Bunnygugu Bara Gadigal, Mayin Galang. Nadu Bunnygu Muji Gangul, Biyambulgul, Maradalbul, Yandulbul, Yindimaninjul, Nulaway Gunana, Mundangulwu. So basically I just said my name is Carolyn, and I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people. I would like to acknowledge all the elders past, present, and respect them for a long time. And I just said, thank you. So yeah, I'm a First Nations hip hop artist and I've been an activist a really long time. I'm a resident at 82 Wentworth Park Road, Glebe, that is going to be, it's slated to be demolished by the government. Big boo on that level. And the announcement only happened last year. So I'll go further into that, but at the moment my role is just to do the acknowledgement and then we'll talk further about my experiences living in public housing and what the government's up to. Thank you. Okay, want me to do that now? Yeah, I moved into 82 Wentworth Park Road 30 years ago, and it came at a time in my life when things were really dire. I had some years ago, prior to that, gotten really unwell, and I was in a pretty bad way and nearly died as well. I'd moved something like 40 times. Some of that time was because of poverty, and some of it was because later on I was just working too much and, you know, you get distracted and you're like, oh, well, I can move. I've got the privilege. I don't have to sit around here and put up with that landlord or that neighbour or whatever. And so when I moved into 82 Wentworth Park Road, Glebe, I thought, oh, this is fantastic. You know, it had a view of the park and all the neighbours were talking to each other. I just not experienced anything like that. And they said that I was going to have that apartment for life. And yeah, it really made me quite emotional when I moved in. And then anyway, I got to know a fair amount of my neighbours. Quite a few of us got older, not me as much as some others. And there was a lot of support there, a lot of helping each other out when things got bad, providing services and support that basically the government is supposed to supply, but they don't. And anyway, when the announcement happened last year, it was earlier in the year, Land and Housing Corporation turned up on my doorstep, unannounced, and I had a feeling it was coming. It was something that had been discussed for quite some time amongst quite a few activists. And they said, we're going to survey the property for future redevelopment. And I said, oh, so you're going to redevelop then, demolished, really? And there was this shocked look on the dude's face. And I thought, well, don't, you know, fairy story it for me. I know what you're up to. I'm right near the new Pyrmont Fish Market that they're building, which nobody bloody wants. No one's going to benefit from that lives in the area. And, you know, and that's going to bring in a lot of tourist money for the government. It's not going to benefit anybody local. So I thought, well, we're the closest public building to that, public housing building, second closest building generally to that. So, yeah, I grilled them for about half an hour about what they were up to. And one part of the conversation, they said, oh, we're going to make it 100% public housing. And 5 or 10 minutes or whatever later, oh, we're going to make it 100% social housing. And I said, well, I actually know the difference. You know, he was obviously a salesman. That's the best way to put it. Then maybe a month or two later, he comes back, the same Land and Housing Corporation dude and somebody else, and pretty much says the same thing, but also we are actually going to go ahead with the development. We're doing this now. And we had pretty much the same discussion where he brought up public housing and then the next part of the conversation, social housing. And I let him know I know the difference between the two. And it made no difference at all. He was just a salesman. And so during this process, I've had 3 neighbours die. The first one, I think he knew what was coming, and we all had a sense in a way. My neighbour Peter was an RN, and he'd recently retired. He was about to buy a new car, go on another holiday. He'd been supporting other neighbours, and somehow he must have known what was going to happen, and he's committed suicide. And, you know, the depression just got too much. And then when they made it all official, we've had 2 more neighbours die. One basically he was a very vulnerable person. He'd been self-medicating for a number of years. But, you know, like one of those really quite sensitive people. And it was often hard to explain to him, don't worry, mate, we'll help. You know, we're there for you. But somehow he was just found in the street one day. So we don't know exactly what happened. And then less than a couple of months ago, another neighbour that was evicted basically during the most rainy day last year, somebody that's frail that can barely walk, his stress levels increased, and he just was getting more falls. He was constantly expressing how unhappy he was with the move. And he ended up in hospital at last getting all the scans that he should have had done years ago, but because the system is so backed up, he didn't get them until this year. And they found brain cancer, and during that process, he said, my dying wish is that you get the place that they've moved me to because it's a bit nice. And he knew that a lot of public housing is not as maintained as well as what it should be. And he's since passed away, and I've taken on the cat that's now passed through. I'm the 3rd owner. And it's been a very unhappy, very stressful experience. And I knew that it's going to take me a long time during this process to get my mental health back up there again. And that's one of the problems that happens when people are treated abysmally by the government. You know, we're human beings. I'm not the building, but the building means a lot to me. It's a home that I haven't had most of my life. I've never lived anywhere 30 years, never, ever. So you just never know when it happens to you that somebody all of a sudden will tell you that you can't live here anymore for whatever reason. That, yeah, it's sort of making me upset even thinking about it. And during this process, I've got to grieve my friends, my neighbours. We all used to gather in the backyard, get a bit of sunshine. The cat and the dog would play together. The building cat and the building dog, they were both 10 years old. They met as puppy and kitten, and it was so funny. I've even got YouTube videos of the cat chasing the dog around the backyard. They just absolutely loved it. And that is broken. That won't be happening again. Because one of those neighbours that lives with the dog, she's moved out and I don't know where. And this is the type of thing that they do. They divide everyone, they tell everyone a different story, and you just don't know where people have gone. Luckily, some of the people that have been relocated still live in Glebe. And I have some contact with them, but it's not the same thing as sitting on my porch and, you know, somebody's walking by going to the shops or they're going to church or whatever it might be. It's just not the same thing. Or gathering in the backyard, doing a bit of gardening together. These are the things that I won't get again. Because I've got to get to know a whole different other set of people, and do I really want to do that again anyway? You know, I think it's just going to be me and the cat now, and my activist friends. But I'm not sure what else I should raise. Yeah, okay, that's enough from me.
Thank you so much, Carolyn, for sharing your story. This is the current state of things. But first of all, I'd like to say a warm welcome to everyone for taking the time to attend our forum tonight, both in person and online. I'd like to start by acknowledging that tonight we are meeting on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I would also like to thank Action for Public Housing for gathering us all here tonight. We will be discussing alternatives to the current state of public housing development. I'm sure everyone attending shares my belief that public housing is an integral part of our Australian housing system. Normally, this is the part where I share some numbers and statistics to try and convince you of what I'm about to say, but we all know the numbers, we all know the facts, and there's more than enough evidence for me to state the obvious truth. Our housing system is broken. In the past 10 years, while everyone is trying to buy a home that's increasingly unaffordable, being pushed out by landlords who are constantly raising rents, the New South Wales government has sold off over $3 billion of public housing assets. In the same shame, real shame. What's sold is lost and we can never get it back. In the same 10 years, the public housing waiting list has not budged from a whopping 50,000 people waiting to access a public housing home. These people, who are generally low income, disadvantaged, with nowhere to go, they have no choice in the current housing market, private rental, Game of Thrones that we live in right now. Public housing is the only choice. It's the only form of affordable housing that they have access to, and if they're lucky enough, currently living in. The current sell-off, knockdown, rebuild policy that the government is enacting, which has seen the sell-off of a countless number of large-scale public housing estates, including Millers Point, Ivanhoe, Riverwood, and many others. You know, those homes are never coming back into public ownership, and that land is lost. But we still have some left over that we need to protect. Waterloo being the biggest one in inner Sydney right now. And the topic of tonight is Glebe Public Housing Estate. Tonight, I would like to ask everyone the question, what do we need to do in the next 10 years to avoid finding ourselves here again in another 10 years in an even worse housing situation than we are now? To help answer this question, we are joined by a diverse panel of speakers and community activists who will share research, case studies, and personal stories about how we can improve the current state of our public housing system. Dr. Hans is an architect and postdoctoral associate of the University of Sydney Rothwell Chair Program. He will share his insights in international case studies of how public housing redevelopment has been approached differently in other countries outside of Australia. There are ways to do things differently that other countries have tried and tested, and it works. Steve Minturn and Simon Robertson of Office, a not-for-profit multidisciplinary design and research practice based in Melbourne, will share their retain, refurbish, reinvest model, which approaches public housing redevelopment with a retain and improve first mindset rather than knock down and rebuild. Finally, we have Emily and Ian from Hands Off Glebe and the Glebe Society to present their community-led vision to save the Glebe, Franklin Street and Wentworth Park Road public housing estates. And they have developed a community-led alternative vision to retain and refurbish the public housing estates with the help of Hector Abrahams, the principal architect of Hector Abrahams Architecture. At the end of the speeches, we will open up the forum to questions from the audience, both in person and online. In particular, we would love to hear from any public housing residents here tonight who has experienced redevelopment, relocation, or is currently going through the process to share their stories and how that has impacted them. Before we start, a couple of housekeeping measures. Am I speaking loud enough? Yeah, this level is good. Cool. For everyone, louder.
Yep.
For those in the back. Note for the speakers, this is how loud you need to speak. For those joining us in person tonight, please save all of your questions until the panel discussion at the end. When you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and I'll ask you for the question and repeat it for everyone online so they can hear. For those joining us online, please mute your microphones if you haven't already and add your questions to the chat window and I will alternate between in-person and online questions. We will also be taking photos and recording the session tonight. So if you if you would like to not have your photo taken, please raise your hand now. And for those, photographers, please take note over there. And for those joining us online, please turn off your cameras if you haven't already. And, well, sorry, 1 second. All right, well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker.
Excuse me, you asked if you were speaking loud enough.
Nope.
You said you weren't, and you're speaking at the same amount. Oh, I can't hear you at all.
I'm sorry, I'm having technical issues. That's why I was like trying to multitask.
Why don't you move to the front? If you'd like to move to the front, there's a speaker seat at the front.
Is there a space seat up there?
Yes,
Yes,
yeah, there is.
there's one here. All right. Well, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Hannes Frykholm is an architect, educator, and researcher. He holds a PhD in architecture from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. His doctoral thesis, Building the City from the Inside, considers entrance situations that occur between buildings and cities in order to develop new ways of investigating architecture and urban transformation. He was a practicing architect in Sweden for 10 years and is a member of FYR Architects, a Stockholm and Madrid-based practice. Since 2022, he has been the Rothwell Chair Postdoctorate Associate at the University of Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning, in collaboration with Anne Lacaton and John Philippe Basal. His current research is on the interior urbanism of housing, and on Tuesday, he will discuss international exemplars of retrofitting and refurbishing public housing. Please give a round of applause to welcome Dr. Hannes.
So we're going to have the same challenge with people perhaps not hearing me. Please tell me if I'm not speaking loud enough. I will try to raise my voice. And I'm going to, is it okay that I sit?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Do we have a microphone? I can try to speak like this.
Are you giving the people on Zoom to see as well?
We've got a microphone just there.
Okay, so maybe they can hear me the best. I would also like to just begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Ora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and future. And I want to thank Alistair and Action for Public Housing for organizing this event, and thanks to Caroline for that testimony of life in public housing in Sydney. I thought was very strong. So Alistair asked me to reflect on some international precedents, and I would say something brief about one example of transformation as an alternative to demolition. The Grand Park housing project in Bordeaux by Lacaton Vassal architects, and say something about what I see as the possible main outtakes of this that could have relevance in a context here in Sydney and in Australia. Let's see if we can get this thing to work. I had some issues before. I try. Didn't work. Try harder.
Every time you point, I'll press the button.
Okay. I always do like this. Excellent. Thanks, Alistair. Okay, so but I think just yeah. So yeah, because I want to say something initially about the environmental impact here too, sort of as a background to the question we're discussing, or the problems we're discussing here today. So Joseph Grima is part of the Italian research collective Space Caviar, who asks a really good question in a recent publication. How many architects, he wonders, have visited the pit and riverbed from which the sand is extracted to make the concrete for their buildings? And in a context of Sydney or New South Wales, we can ask in a similar manner, how many architects have visited places like this? The Marulan limestone mine southwest of Sydney on the unceded land of the Gundungura people. Places like this that are necessary for the production of concrete. So this is the kind of landscape that the densification and expansions of cities like Sydney create. We tend to forget this. The processes of urban development are supported by the extraction of resources from other places, often far away from the city and outside of our scope somehow. As towers rise from the ground in one place, there are holes appearing in the ground elsewhere. And the fractures are not only geological, they displace entire communities. Buildings are pieces of mining equipment, architectural theorist Mark Wigley suggests. They belong to processes of violent extraction, and they cause rapid destruction to the planet. So as an example, the extraction and curing process of cement is estimated to be the source of about 8% of the world's total carbon dioxide emission. 8%, think about that. So I think it's important to remember this kind of landscape when we face development proposals that begin with demolition, as if demolition is just a small footnote somehow. But if we refuse to support the idea of a tabula rasa of demolition, what are the alternative strategies for densification and for creating more housing? Because we need more housing, clearly. Okay, so moment. So I will say something brief then about this project. This is constructed in the 1960s. The Grand Park is a post-war social housing project of more than 4,000 dwellings in central Bordeaux in South France. In 2011, French architects Lacaton Vassal, together with Frédéric Roth and Christopher Hutin, who's also architects, they won a competition with a proposal to transform 3 of these buildings, in total 530 apartments. And the proposal by Lacaton Vassal was done with the intention to increase the quality and comfort of the flats, of the existing flats, and to give each unit more space. And it was also part of the proposal that no tenants should be displaced during this process, but also not after the process. So it's after the completion. So really important to keep the rents down in this. We can say that the challenge here was to how to transform without the typical kind of renovation that would happen in these cases. So Lacaton Vassal developed a strong economic argument for transformation instead of demolition. Through careful calculations of each square meter, they showed that the cost of demolition and redevelopment would be higher than the renovation and addition of more space to the existing structure. So the argument in this was really that there should be no major changes to the existing concrete structures, the existing floors and the stairs, but instead the budget should be spent on making minor updates to infrastructures and amenities that were already there, and to add an extension to the south facade of the building so that each apartment would get an extension. And this is the existing plan before the refurbishment. It's oops, one too much, go back. It's good I looked back. So it's a 175-meter long building, 15 floors. Each vertical core has 3 apartments. And the plan, as you see, has a central corridor here that serves most of all of the rooms in the apartment and serves for the circulation. And the balconies are withdrawn into the building so that the balcony railing align with the facade. Now you can change. So the principle that they suggested of addition here is very clear in this drawing. It's a typical existing flat would have all the windows replaced with double glazing panels, so window panels, that opens onto a 2.8 meter deep winter garden. And outside of this then, a 1 meter balcony. So there are sliding panels of polycarbonate. You see them in magenta in this drawing. Here, to enclose the winter garden space when it's colder, and they also have reflective curtains to prevent from overheating on hot days. And this is then the proposed typical floor plan. So we see in blue here the addition in plan section. So this was an independent structure along the existing building. Here we see it. To provide each apartment with a winter garden and a balcony. And on the roof, there was also the addition of completely new apartments here. A couple, not that many, but maybe 6, 7. And on the other side, so on the northern side of the slab, there was an additional elevator so that each core had 2 elevators instead of 1. You can change. And this is a photo from the construction process where the extension is being added to the facade. So you see on the left, you see the existing facade, and to the right, the added winter garden and the balcony being added. You can change. So the result of this was that all of the existing apartments had a lot more space, between 30 to 50 square meters of winter garden and up to 11 square meters of balcony. And many of the apartments also had additional interior space. In total, the project added more than 38,000 square meters to the existing 68,000 square meters. So this was an addition of 53% floor area. And because of the winter gardens, the energy consumption was reduced by half in this building. So the winter garden has a thermal effect as well. And all of this was done without a dramatic increase of the rent. So the argument that they used in this project was, instead of replacing 1 with 1, we can replace 1 with 1.5 and keep the rent the same. So this is the project after completion. And we can see the new facade. And of course, it's a very big project. It was going on for several years. And I think the architects themselves could speak much better and in more detail about it. What I would like to do is to point to three aspects in this that I think are relevant for an Australian context of densification and transformation as well. The first one is the importance of paying attention. So these are photos of the apartments after the transformation of the Grand Park. But there's an identical series from before where almost, I think, every single apartment was documented and studied, and most of the inhabitants were consulted. So attention here means multiple methods of site investigation that happens in parallel. So to survey and understand structural integrity and material conditions of these buildings, of course, to study closely existing plans and spatial organizations, but also to understand in depth the ways that the tenants, that the inhabitants use their apartments and the immediate surroundings. So it's the notion of paying attention, I think, is really key here. And we can also, it's interesting to draw the parallel to the French expression faire attention, which implies faire is the making. So the making or doing of attention. So attention is a construction. It's a process of inventing new methods for looking at all the life that is already existing on any site. It's an immense richness that is already there that we have to protect and be careful of. Like the dogs and the cat playing together. All these kind of ecologies are on the site already. We just have to develop our tools to read them and understand them much better and be more, appreciate them. It's also a project about looking from the inside. So a transformation that goes from the inside. There's another layer I would also add to this so that in terms of attention, and it's about following up and returning to the building. Lacaton Vassal did several post-occupancy studies, talking to inhabitants, documenting the shifting uses of the winter garden and measuring the thermal conditions of these additions. This is a still from one of the 10 documentary films they produced together with the French filmmaker Karim Danat, returning to the project, this is Grand Park again, to discuss with inhabitants. So there's a slowness and care in this approach to stay with a project over a long time. So if the architects should visit the riverbeds and the mines used for making the concrete, they should also continue to visit the project they design after completion, to continue a dialogue with the inhabitants and to support the duration of a building project over time. This sense of care, I think, also reverberates in the second point I'd like to make around this project, which is the design of the process. So the idea of this was that no one would have to leave their home for longer than 1 or 2 days during this entire process. And those 2 days was for the installation of the facade elements. Besides from that, it would be possible to stay during the entire process. But to follow through on a promise like that, to not displace, it actually requires quite a great effort. How do we protect inhabitants from the noise, the pollution, the dangers of living right next to a building site? So I think there was a lot of work in designing the process of this transformation, to the point that we can think of the design of the process as equally or almost as equally as important as the end result somehow. The logic of adding here meant that there were very few internal moments in the refurbishment. So we see here the addition of the extension made of precast concrete elements. That also meant it was a very fast process. So 5 to 7 elements will be added per day. And once these were installed, the extension worked as the scaffolding for the transformation of the facade. So here we see an opening of the existing facade and the removal of the old windows. And you can see how the interiors are covered here using plastic film so that it would protect the interiors and people can remain. And each of these replacements took maximum 2 days. So here the frames and the sliding glass doors have been installed, and the furniture is still there. So it's effectively is ready to live again. And there might be a couple of layers of paint and etc., but it's really small stuff in the larger context. The tenants will be in the house, they will remain. Yep. And once the new glass panels were in place, a lot of the work could continue on the outside with railings, etc., because most of the project lay in the exterior. You can change. So this is just to show you some before and after shots of this process. This is looking at the facade from the outside. And this is standing with the camera on the extension looking alongside the facade. And this is an interior view, so looking from the building and out. And we can see that the transformation also changed the existing rooms quite radically. So the third point is the result of this intervention and the generosity that I think it brings. The resulting free space, it's not about the aesthetics of a building facade or the historical relevance or anything about that, but much more about the fundamental qualities here of inhabitation that can be provided by ample space and light. So I think this is it's an example of the kind of generosity that architecture can provide in some moments. Because the argument is remarkably clear in a way. We should strive for more space for less money, and it's space that's not overdetermined by us as the architects or designers, but space that is free to appropriate. And what happened here is that we have 530 different ways that this winter garden has been appropriated over time. When you step out on this, there's an immediate contact with the outdoor. And it's this strange sensation that we feel like we're in a villa almost, with an amazing view over the city and with so much additional space. The free space has several other effects, positive effects. So I mentioned already the depth of the addition also works as a temperature barrier, a kind of buffer zone between the inside and outside to regulate the temperature. And the addition of the winter garden changes the plan drastically from being rooms laid out along an inner corridor. All of the rooms, or almost all of the rooms, are now part of a larger circulation. So it's the possibility of entering each room from two different directions, either from the existing corridor or from the winter garden. Okay, so I've outlined three, I think, important aspects of this project. The first is the importance of paying attention to all that is already there. The second is the careful design of the process of transformation. And thirdly, the importance of free space, or to not over-determine the added space, but to allow inhabitation to happen over time. And Grand Park is, I think, is one example, but obviously transformation can happen in many other ways than as just adding winter gardens. It seems that the key point here is the sensitivity to the existing site and care in the design proposal, and the kind of absolute condition that we will do this project only if we can ensure that all the tenants get to stay. So there will be no displacement and there will be no demolition of anything. Okay. So finally, then, if we return to Australia, it's good to remember that comment of Mark Wigley again. Buildings are effectively mining equipments. They make holes in the ground and they drive climate change. Buildings that are demolished was once built with material dug up and removed from somewhere. And the process will be repeated with every new redevelopment. Refusing demolition is also to refuse the demolition of existing community and the violent acts of displacement and eviction. And obviously Waterloo comes to mind, but we know that there are many other examples, as we heard, of areas that are facing demolition in Sydney. So we need to think around what a non-extractive architecture could be. And I think it puts new expectations on the professions of architects and planners. The challenge is to develop methods for studying more closely the life of a site, to take existing buildings and their tenants much more seriously and to study it from the inside of buildings, and to search for ways to densify without creating these new holes somewhere else. Okay, so I will end by a bit of a plug, or what you call it, by inviting you all to the exhibition that I've been part of curating. It will open at the Tinchets Gallery at the University of Sydney next week. It's called Lakaton Vasal Living in the City. And it deals in depth with some of the methods of transformation that I talk about and how these can also be used to understand the context in Sydney. So We have, for example, a beautiful screening of all the documentary films that I mentioned by Karin Dana on inhabitation. University of Sydney students have worked in a program coordinated by Anne Lacaton and Jean-Philippe Vassal, considering Waterloo and other sites with this kind of lens, asking questions around how can we develop methods for paying attention? How can we transform and densify the city without demolishing what is already there? So please come and visit this when you have a moment. There's going to be several events around the exhibition, and I think it will be quite a remarkable manifestation of the alternative approaches to development, we can say. Okay, thank you. No questions now, we hand over.
Thank you so much, Hannes.
Thank you.
Our next speakers are Emma and Ian, who represent Hands Off Glebe and Hands Off Glebe is an incorporated community association. You can see.
Yeah,
Yes, I'll go. Yes, I'll start. Which
I don't know if you want to take it up. I'm doing the introduction.
Oh, okay.
Stand next to me as I introduce these amazing people. So Emma and Ian, they represent Hands Off Glebe, a community association that campaigns for the people of Glebe, and in particular, to protect the low-income community and for decent public housing. They first came together to protect Cowper Street and Elger Street public housing, and have since campaigned to save public housing at Franklin Street and Wentworth Park Road. Earlier this year, Hands Off Glebe published the Franklin Report, making the case for retaining and refurbishing the Franklin Street estate. That campaign was successful, with the New South Wales government recently announcing it would retain the complex. Hands Off Glebe continues to fight for 82 Wentworth Park Road and will introduce an alternative proposal for the site at this forum, designed by architect Hector Abrahams. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm Ian. I'm involved with the Glebe Society, Hands Off Glebe, and Action for Public Housing. And there's a good message here, which is activism keeps you young. I'm just going to give a bit of context to Glebe. It's a very special place. And it's a place where a lot of the issues about community and identity and livability were pioneered over 40 years ago. Over 700 houses in Glebe were owned by the Church of England, and they had a very long tradition of being places that were low-income tenancies. And in 1974, the federal government, the Whitlam government, led by the Minister for Urban and Regional Development, Tom Uren, purchased the church estate, 700 houses, 29 commercial properties. Gough Whitlam doesn't have a good reputation as being an economic manager, but we've heard recently that Blue Poles is the most valuable picture, but he was pilloried for buying it. He bought 700 houses in Glebe for $16.5 million. So it was a pretty good deal, I think. Now, the purpose of buying the houses, this is what they stated, was to avoid disruption to existing community networks, to retain the opportunity for low-income earners and families and aged people to live close to the city. And that's become more and more important as we've seen suburbs of a working class like Paddington and Redfern become gentrified, and Glebe, with its large amount of public housing in 19th century housing stock, is becoming unique, really, as an inner city community with a broad social demographic. Rehabilitate an historic suburb, which had the largest continuous number of 1860s and 70s cottages and terraces, forming a continuous townscape in Australia, and add additional density, and this is a very important part, add additional density, which respected Glebe's character and scale. And you can see here a shot of the back of some terraces in the St. Philip's estate, and they still look like this. They still have this wonderful enfilade of outhouses and chimneys and etc. What am I doing wrong? Yes. And so the refurbishment of the houses, they did a great job. They put back the fences, they reinstated original colour schemes, and then as well, they refurbished them. They made them good for modern living. They did very sensitive additions at the back with new kitchens and bathrooms. And in fact, this work was cost effective. There's a book published in the 1980s, Glebe project, and it goes into details about the economies of scale of looking after these houses, but doing them. It's that kind of classic idea about modern architecture, that if you repeat something multiple times, it becomes more cost effective. And this is that idea, but applied to conservation. Next one. They also, as I said, envisaged right from the beginning that there would be infill housing. And this is a model of the Glebe project when the federal government were running it in the late 70s. And it shows what's known as the Bishopthorpe estate, that's west of Glebe Point Road. And where I've highlighted, they're back lanes. And so they plan to conserve, but then to also provide additional sensitive infill, which didn't destroy the scale and character of the historic subdivisions. Next. Another element, I mentioned the two church estates, but there's another estate. It wasn't owned by the church, the Lyndhurst estate. It's called the Lyndhurst estate after this historic house, 1837 house, designed by John Burge. And much of the Lyndhurst estate was acquired by the state government in the 1960s, acquired in fact by the Department of Main Roads to be demolished for a freeway. And you can see this is a cartoon from the Glebe Society that shows the freeway eating the suburb. And then on the right of the screen is a slice showing the houses that were demolished. The pink houses were demolished. The red houses survived. Lyndhurst was going to be demolished, but it wasn't. And one of the great things, I mentioned the federal government. In 1983, the Fraser government transferred the estates to the state government. They thought, well, why does the federal government have social housing, public housing in New South Wales? So they were transferred to the state government. 1977, Neville Wran had been elected. He scrapped the freeway project. And then under his premiership, the Housing Commission, using in-house public servant architects, not only completed the renovation of the old houses, but they designed fantastic infill, the equivalent of over 1,000 bedrooms. Next slide. And it was beautifully done, this project. Walter Burley Griffin, in analysing what makes good architecture, one of the things he said was that buildings must be designed with joy and affection. And you get a real sense when you go around the infill housing that these public servant architects did, that they did it with passion. And everything is bespoke. It was no kind of standard approach. Everything was fitted to its site. That's 82 Wentworth Park Road on the left, and some housing in Bridge Road, quite a busy road, hence the brick wall. Next. And John Gregory, who was in charge of the inner city housing team, he said to me that when they decided how they did infill, the rhythm of the subdivisions was very important. They had to make it fit the rhythm of the subdivisions. And this is a photograph of Glebe. This is the St Philip's estate. You can see it's largely terrace houses with some interwar infill housing. They had to work out what made a community. And so the terrace houses with their small front gardens and verandas, they connect people to the community. They create intimate places where when you walk along the street, you see your neighbour, you have a chat. So they echoed that in the infill that they did. Next slide. And this is one of the examples of their buildings. This is 17 to 31 Cowper Street. That contained 17 one-bedroom apartments, and nearby were 4 modern terrace houses with each 3 bedrooms. So there were let me see, 4 by 3 is 12 plus 17 is 29. There were 29 bedrooms in these complexes. Unfortunately, 3 years ago, next slide, it was demolished. And shame, exactly. And what do we have 3 years later? We had This was a place where 29 people could live. What do we have 3 years later? Nothing. Nothing. And next slide. This is the building that it's going to be replaced with. It still hasn't risen above ground level, so it'll probably be 5 years that we've lost 27 houses. And I threw in a cartoon from a 1970s book about the green bands. My mother was very happy in those flats, very happy until she jumped out the window. Next slide. I mentioned two parts of the Glebe project. The conservation of the old houses, which was done so successfully, largely by the Housing Commission of New South Wales. Unfortunately, they have been very badly looked after. These are estates that we own. They belong to us and they are being very badly managed. The Land and Housing Corporation doesn't seem to understand that gutters are intended to carry off roof water. They seem to think they're for plants. And various housing ministers have said, with a slight tinge of outrage, these are high maintenance houses, meaning that the poor shouldn't live in them anymore. They should be sold off, that all the old houses in Glebe should be completely gentrified. But of course, everything becomes high maintenance if you don't do any maintenance. And in fact, with these houses, the hard yards have been done. In the 1980s, they worked out how to do the additions without compromising the places. They worked out how to conserve them in the paint schemes. They just need some basic maintenance and painting and new kitchens and bathrooms. Next slide. So there has been a slight progressively selling off of some of these houses, when in fact there are great opportunities there to repair the houses, to keep them as public housing, and then to put good sensitive infill in the backyards. And you can see here, see how all these houses are all on one title. You've got the odd one that's on its own title. These are houses that the Land and Housing Corporation still own. They're still on the large titles when they were owned by the church. And to the right of the slide is in Cumberland Street in the Rocks. And that's a bit of well-designed infill that was added by the Sydney Cove Authority about 20 years ago to the back of houses in Cumberland Street. And we could have more of that in Glebe and keep the quality of the place, not destroy it, respect it, but add new density. Next slide. And next one. Glebe says no, but we don't say no. We're positive people in Glebe. What we say no to is DOPI, the acronym DOPI. I made an acronym, which I've lost the piece of paper I wrote it down. So I'm going to have to try and remember. Oh, thank you. DOPI is about planning. It's about the sort of planning we're getting now. DOPI is deceitful. DOPI is opportunistic. DOPI is predatory. And DOPI is incompetent. And that's what we want an end to, DOPI planning. Next slide. So we say no to DOPI, but we say yes to intelligent design. Design which adds density while respecting community, environment, identity, and livability. Thank you very much.
Yes, and I am a tenant in Franklin Street, and I, support the Welcome to Country and remind you that we stand on stolen land. We live here and fail to respect the care for country that living on Aboriginal land should entail. We, as a nation, exclude all values of importance of place and country. We do not tread lightly on the land. The proposed demolition of well-designed Wentworth Park Road complex is a symptom of our society's attitude to land and the environment. We know how successful public housing is. Good for social and health outcomes, cheaper than homelessness, creates inclusiveness, builds community, and helps the most needy out of poverty. Vital in closing the gap for our First Nations families. Australia has a strong and popular public housing history, which must not be negated. Yet here we are fighting to protect public housing stock. We have lost the Rocks. We are losing Redfern, Wollongong, Erskineville and more. The whole state, the whole country is under attack. It must be stopped. The present state government wants to build on the shameful history of its predecessor. The backward community housing plus policy still raises its ugly head. It is community minus for tenants. Poorly thought out building rushed through before the election are still being considered. So-called developers want an empty site so they can replace it with so-called well-designed building that are ill-conceived high-rise. People will lose their much-loved homes. We will lose our friends and neighbours. We will lose our community. I know and love Glebe. I am active in the community. I am the Secretary of Hands Off Glebe and have worked hard to fight against the New South Wales Government policies. In Glebe, the attack on infill properties built by the Labor government 30 and 40 years ago is ongoing and relentless. The Liberals want to wipe out Labor's history, but why is the present New South Wales government so convinced that it's a good thing? My personal worth is not considered when the policy was thought up. I, as a public housing tenant, are disposable, to be brushed aside, forced to live under new rules by a new landlord, a community housing provider. Where is the kindness and respect to tenants who are some of the most needy in our society? We see the outcome of the policy down the road from me in Elgar Street, Glebe. The empty private dwellings, never occupied, on ex-public housing land. Occupiers drive in and drive out and exclude themselves from the neighbourhood. The street is empty, the community gone. Bridge housing tenants hanging out in a tiny little entranceway chatting. No garden or green space. It's awful. The dismal community garden is being blown away in the wind tunnel the buildings create. It is not a mixed community as it was spruiked. It is segregated. We as tenants are informed that we will be better off in high rise as we will have lifts, easy access. But it is what expense to our health. My stairs keep me fit. So does my garden. The noise of children and birds give me pleasure and is good for my mental health, unlike living under the threat of eviction and relocation. I worry for families and particularly large mixed groups. Building of cell-like apartments does not accommodate them. My Aboriginal neighbours with 5 children will be put back in the mission system. Community housing providers. It is cruel and humiliating to think that Mission Australia or some other quasi-religious housing provider may become their landlord. My complex is saved from demolition by strong and continuous protest and action since the demolition was proposed 3 years ago. We learned a lot from previous fights for Elgar Street, fights for Wentworth Park Road, Chapel Street that Ian showed. We learned a lot and we won our case, but it goes on. Wentworth, 82 Wentworth Park Road, and today I heard of another property threatened development. Not development, but destruction. The fight goes on and on. My home needs refurbishing. The density of the complex can be increased. Redesigning, retrofitting will benefit tenants and house more people. It will save money, be environmentally friendly, and it will protect the much-loved trees and gardens and retain the community rather than split and disseminate it. Stop the destruction of our heritage and our estate. Protect and extend public housing. Signed this for Wentworth Park Road because we've only got till the end of the week.
Eveleigh mentioned that they have had undertakings that Franklin Street will not be demolished. And this is an amazing victory. And it's a victory that really we can all take heart from, because these battles are so difficult, and it's difficult to see the minister, it's difficult to get a reply to letters to the minister. And then when you do get a reply, it's all doublespeak. You know, the logic is just ignored. The achievement, can you put your hand up, Dennis Doherty at Eveleigh, their achievement in saving Franklin Street is incredible, and it is the result of at least 2 years, isn't it?
3 years. Well, 2.5, I suppose. Yeah.
Close enough.
4.
A dogged work, but some of it very smart work. You've probably seen the postcards that they distribute and they send to the minister. And so the minister has, what, 1,000 of these postcards saying save Franklin Street. And I visited a previous minister about Harbour Street. It didn't do any good. We didn't send enough postcards. We didn't send any, actually. We should have. But she said to me, we talked about Franklin Street, and she said, oh, they're the people who send me the postcards. So I think a big hand for the two of them, you know, inspiring. You've shown it can be done. We've just got to be at it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Hector Abrams. And Hector is both a conservation architect, a very distinguished conservation architect, and also a design architect. And he's done some great work across this city, and some of it very inventive, including turning the former Wallara Congregational Church, you know, it's in a kind of bit of an inferior suburb, that suburb to the east, Wallara, but turning the Wallara Congregational Church into wonderful apartments. So welcome, Hector, and thank you. Hector, I also want a big round of applause for Hector before we start. Because we know in our hearts that things can be done better, but we're up against it when it comes to building our case. And Hector, in an act of great generosity, has come up with an alternative scheme for 82 Wentworth Park Road. I'm not going to steal your thunder, but an alternative scheme which is both better, kinder for the environment, better for tenants, and cheaper. So it's a no-brainer, and it's a story we've got to get across. But over to you.
Right. Well, I'll let the drawings do the talking. Although if you look at me, I've got a coat on here that's one I purchased as a student when I went to Sydney Uni in 1979. So that's the approach. Next. So these were the beautiful drawings produced by Gregory and his Land and Housing Corporation in the early 1980s. And you heard Emily speak so eloquently about their simple understanding of how a street works. And to give, if you go back, these are in the form of a terrace, but some of them are in fact terrace houses, but others are apartments, but they're in the form of a terrace. They're load-bearing cavity brickwork. They're in conventional construction. They're built like tanks. In the middle is a grand archway you go through, and you can park your car if you're some of the tenants for whom parking is provided, or there's a drying area as well. And the Glebe Society simply asked me, could we possibly keep these and add a lane building on the back? Next. So this is the agenda. At the bottom is Wentworth Park Road.
He suggested the attack could have been staged by Russia.
These are the grid of houses that Gregory put there almost 40 years ago. And this is the archway. Here are the car parking spaces, and I'm placing a slice building on those car parking spaces above the spaces. I'm taking away the laundry drying area here. More of that later. Next. Now I've turned you round to Bellevue Street, which is on the bottom, and Bellevue Street's a good 5 to 8 metres above Wentworth Park Road. And here we've put a slice building that has a series of 17 public housing dwellings, varying from I think 4 bed sits to about 8 2-bedroom apartments and everything in between. Next. And this is the generic plan for levels 1, 2 and 3. And you can see they work as a slice. Every house and every window in every house faces north. And the circulation is compact along this narrow thing here, which has a lift at the back, which is accessible to those that live inside the existing dwellings. They will be able to go into the lift, up the hillside and onto Bellevue Street. Next. So Bellevue Street's a real tricky item. It's as steep as you like. At the bottom is the relationship at the eastern end, where you'll see 2 stories of our new building when the minister agrees to it. And at the top end, you see the bottom of the building, where you'll see actually 4 stories and a lid at the bottom. And that's the light rail hurling past there. And that's the tunnel where you go through to get down to your new fish markets. Next. Actually, if you go back one, on the other side of Bellevue Street, there are existing houses. They're very nice Glebe terrace houses, and they have a view of Wentworth Park. Now, they're not allowed to have that view, are they? Of course they are. Next. So here is the Wentworth Park elevation. Now, this line, this crinkly line here, is the roofscape of Gregory's houses in the 1980s. And this blob up here is my proposal, and it dips down in the middle and goes back up at the end. Why does it dip down in the middle?
So the people have their view.
So these terrace houses have their view. Thank you. Why can't we do that sort of thinking? Really? Next. It's only a matter of being sensible. And this is the view that you will have if you stand on the corner of Cardigan and Bellevue. Down here is the light rail viaduct. There's a light rail going to Piedmont. In the distance is the Glebe Island Bridge. Rising up this rather steep street are the 2 blobs. Here's the eastern blob, of which you're only seeing 2 stories. And there's the western blob, of which you're seeing 4 stories. And in the middle, you see an array of open verandas, and that's the circulation system. The lift occupies the middle. There are 2 ramps. Actually, there are 3 ramps up from Bellevue Street into different levels of those walkways. Those walkways aren't the long 100-metre long walkways that you might see in sort of mega public housing. In the 60s, these are only a couple of days long. You can only meet 6 people, all of whom you will know when you go up one of those, and their friends and relatives. So it's intimate, it's properly scaled, it's fitted into the landscape. And finally, if you go on to the next one, please. This is the accommodation schedule. There are 17 apartments. You can see the floor areas. If you know your numbers, you'll see they're more than generous. Each apartment has a bathroom, but only one. And then
requires countries that launch objects to safely dispose of them, no matter where they.
the current proposal is to demolish the Gregory buildings of the 1980s and put and spend $22 million doing so. This scheme will save you about $30 million. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma and Ian, and the great work of Hands Off Glebe.
And
Really.
Hector.
And Hector. Thank you, Hector. Last but not least, our next speakers are Steve Minturn and Simon Robertson of Office. Office is a not-for-profit multidisciplinary design practice based in Melbourne. As a not-for-profit and a registered charity, their studio's operations, processes, and outputs are bound by constitution to make projects for the public good. Their retain, repair, reinvest model is a site-specific strategy developed by Office for evaluating the refurbishment potential of existing public housing estates. At the core of the strategy is the retention of public housing with the commitment to ensuring housing is as a basic human right. The approach has three key objectives. The objective is to, I'll let them present those. Retain, repair, and reinvest is to demonstrate that it is both technically and economically feasible to retain the existing public housing, as well as providing great social benefit. Please welcome Steve and Simon from Office.
Probably get through all those slides. Yeah. It seems like I'm the only one who can correct the click. Thanks everyone for having us. A real privilege to be invited here. So yeah, thanks for Action for Public Housing for inviting us. And we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners whose land we're on, the Gadigal of Eora Nation, and also the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of who we predominantly live and work. So yeah, we're going to talk through a specific project and two specific projects of a strategy that we've been working on called Retain, Repair, Reinvest. But very briefly, as Eddie touched on, so Simon and I run a not-for-profit and registered charity. We're a registered architecture practice as well. I'm a landscape architect, Simon's an architect. We have a board of directors who are also working across architecture and design, landscape architecture, as well as lawyers and financial advisors. And again, to reiterate what Eddie was saying, the work that we do as a charity is governed by a legally binding constitution to work for the public good. So we only work for the public good. We don't work for private capital. We're not legally allowed to. And so that governs the work that we do and really informs the way in which we approach these strategies and the way in which we work with individual communities.
So just to set the scene of what's been happening in Melbourne for the last 8 years in terms of public housing estate renewal, there's been two key programs starting in 2016, the public housing
match will be played at Sydney's Olympic Stadium. 80,000 people are expected to attend. Most of them will be cheering on the Aussies, but Irish fans are making sure their team feels the love too.
I can do it next time. And the second being the ground lease model, which was announced with the big housing build. And so just a quick overview of the public housing renewal program. It's based on a real estate model, which identified 9 public housing estates in inner city Melbourne, and they determined these estates have latent development capacity. To develop these estates, they enter in a public-private partnership with a 30-70 split, 30% social housing, 70% private. And the design methodology for this is demolition and rebuild. There was apparently a feasibility study done internally that looked at refurbishment and deemed it being too expensive. That report's never been publicly and so the public housing renewal program morphed into the ground lease model in 2021, and this follows a similar approach of being a real estate led model, entered in a PPP contract where the government actually leases, or the developer leases the land from the government for 40 years, and after 40 years the land's handed back to the government. But again, it follows the same methodology of demolition and rebuild. And the diagram down below, which we'll actually end on, shows that the site started with no buildings on there, and that's obviously not the case.
Yeah, so the strategy that we've been working on is called Retain, Repair, Reinvest. So as we mentioned, it's site specific. It's not a model for how to redevelop public housing. It's an approach to looking at individual sites sensitively and understanding what's there. So the core elements of it are retaining existing communities, so not relocating residents, repairing those existing buildings, which is also reducing the environmental impact,
and then reinvesting any of those savings to improve the comfort and upgrade that public housing. And we'll go through how that sort of works within these projects. So on both of the projects, we structured it like you would normally if you're doing a feasibility study. We, as Office of the Design Lead, some of the architect, landscape architect, we have research support from Miriam McGarry. We have an ESD consultant, structural engineer, quantity surveyor, and economic input. And it was really important when we're doing this work because it's advocacy work. And I think it's something I should mention at the start, that we're an independent organisation. We're not funded by any government department, nor are we aligned to any political parties. So in order to we're making sure that we're independent, we're also making sure that this report has the weight that it needs. And in order to do that, we need these sub-consultants to support this. So it's not an architectural only sort of solution, if that makes sense.
So yeah, the motivations for an alternative proposal was obviously the fact that the approach is demolition and rebuild by the government. But as we've heard today as well, just the social impact that's caused through relocation to the health of the residents, education, and then just the community connections that they have, as well as the environmental impact, as Hannes identified before, labour and material shortages that everyone's kind of the impact from COVID, economic impact, heritage value, but also understanding that the public housing renewal program and the ground lease model, it is evolving and it is getting better, but it's starting from a really bad place. But the hope is that they can start to incorporate some of these findings in the future. So this is a map of Melbourne. Melbourne's in the middle, up the river. But these are all the estates that have been identified through the two programs. I think there's 14 in total, and you can see they're all within inner Melbourne. Majority of these have been demolished already, with the rest being earmarked for demolition.
Yeah, so the first one we're looking at is Ascot Vale, which again is an inner city sort of suburb, or sort of middle of the inner city suburb within Melbourne. And so one thing that we wanted to note here as well at both of the estates is that we're only doing this work when we're invited in to undertake this. So we work really closely with the residents, and there on the Ascot Vale estate, there's a really strong organisation that's called SAVE, which is Save Ascot Vale Estate, and working with the residents as if they're our clients, because they are. Again, it's not funded by anyone, so we say that the residents who are living on the estate, they're our clients, and we work directly with them.
So we're just going to start with the findings and then go through how we got there. Sadly, this is an economic argument, so we have to quantify everything as a cost. But obviously we found huge construction cost savings through refurbishment rather than demolition rebuild, and being able to achieve,
Speak louder, please.
And being able to achieve compliance with all contemporary apartment standards. So being access, so specialist disability apartments, but then also meeting energy targets as well. So that was really important to say that these buildings can be refurbished, but also meet contemporary standards of apartments. And obviously, critically avoiding relocation of any throughout this process as well. Avoid health, wellbeing and educational costs through avoiding relocation. And then also quantifying those energy savings or environmental savings through refurbishment. So Ascot Vale Estate was built in the late 40s, and it's a series of 52 three-storey walk-ups. Let's look through these ones. So there's 5 designs replicated throughout this estate, and they're 3-storey double brick buildings with a range of 8 to 10 apartments per building. There's things like communal rooftops with shared laundry facilities, and then obviously established gardens throughout the estate as well. So these photos were taken last year. So this is a condition of the buildings. Rather than looking at the whole estate in its entirety, we because the design's replicated, we decided just to look at one, and we chose this one. In the top left-hand corner, you can see the flat's been burnt out. There was a fire in that flat about 2.5 to 3 years ago. All the tenants were evacuated. That apartment was never fixed, and no one was ever allowed back in. So that's been sitting empty for 2.5 to 3 years. The way that we set up this study, we wanted to compare it against what the government was doing. And back in 2019, they actually demolished a portion of the estate, Dunlop Avenue. and started to undertake the public housing renewal program on that estate. So we're interested in comparing what was being done to there to what could have been done if they had refurbished the buildings. And we're interested in the uncaptured costs. So we all understand there's costs associated to construction, but we wanted to look at what are the costs associated to relocating tenants. So these tenants have to go somewhere, there has to be rent paid or spot purchases in some instances. And then the cost to the economy, which is a little bit more abstract, but the cost that relocating tenants have to the healthcare system, educational system, and then also loss of heritage as well. So we work with the economists to start to quantify some of those things.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, a part of this is we're only doing this work if we are invited in by a community. And so we're running community engagement sessions and working directly with one resident in particular who CFO in a bit, but talking to residents and understanding what they like about the state, what they like about where they live and all those sorts of things. And I think the overarching thing was that the vast majority of people want to remain on the estate. They really like it there. There's the community there. And that's been obviously really clearly articulated for various reasons already tonight, which I think we all understand.
So on the left of the screen is the demolition and on the right is the proposed. This is just showing that we are retaining the bones of the building and we're just removing things like windows, joinery, old kitchens and bathrooms, and then also one of the stair cores to put a lift in. So we're replacing the windows with double glazing windows and then adding new joinery and fixtures and things like that into these apartments. And so this is the proposed renders. You can see the buildings there. We just added things like retractable sunshades to the north, replacing the windows, and then just incorporating some landscape around the building. On the back side, you can see the lift core that's been plugged into the existing stairs, and that makes 90% of the dwellings accessible. And on the bottom floors, we actually converted those into specialist disability apartments as well. So bigger bathrooms, wider doors, those kinds of things. And just the communal rooftop was there, but we just kind of gave a bit more love with communal planting patches and a shade canopy across the top as well. Internal view, so we actually didn't put AC into the air conditioning units into these flats. We could achieve the energy standards by not, but just incorporating passive cooling and heating systems. They're all orientated north facing and they all have dual aspects, so you can get cross ventilation through these flats as well. And through this, we're able to achieve a 38% reduction in energy use, achieve a 7.4 NatHurst rating, so that's how much energy goes into heating and cooling this space, and incorporate things like solar capture and rainwater capture as well. So this is working with the ESD engineer.
Yeah, and so as we mentioned, one of the key driver is the retention of communities. So by spending some time on the estate talking to residents, we understand that there's about a 20% vacancy rate on the estate across 52 buildings. So by looking at a system of refurbishment and decanting residents into new buildings that have been refurbished before, we can stage out the work so that no one would ever have to leave the estate, and they'd be able to do this over time. Yeah, to be able to retain everyone in their home and within their community. As I mentioned, we have an ESD consultant, structural report, quantity surveys and costings, all of these things that support the work that we're doing. Again, we don't want it to be a theoretical architectural exercise. We want to make sure that it is really supported. So then when we release these reports, which are all public, that they can be used by communities to go and advocate for the change that they want to see.
And then, yeah, all these things were quantified. We won't go into this table too much. It's online, but we obviously found there's huge cost savings by doing this.
Yeah, so we produced the advocacy document, which again is online and freely accessible, that has all the information we're going through in much more detail, along with an appendix that has all the supporting document by all the other professionals that helped us out. And a big part of this is public as possible. We went to the media, and so this is Claire, who we work with a lot, and then so trying to use that as a tool to be able to raise awareness around this. I think there's different varying levels of engagement from different governments around, or various knowledge around what public housing even is in some set places, and then trying to really highlight the profile of how valuable it is. And so this building is now being refurbished. The government is retaining it as public housing. It's being refitted out, not our design and not with any engagement with us whatsoever. We had to go and ask the builders who were doing it what was happening. But the building is being retained and it will be retained as public housing, which is great. This probably doesn't matter as much to us, but it's important to notice that the architecture community and design community, there's definitely a big interest in this type of work. We recently received some sort of awards, special mentions. But I think, yeah, and again, so we're talking about this as a replicable strategy. It's not a model that gets deployed again and again. It's a replicable approach that we can take to different housing estates. Yeah, and they're all different. They have different communities, they have different desires. I think one thing to note on that, one of the criticisms of the Ascot Vale work is that we didn't increase dwelling numbers. We just refurbished what was there because we wanted to just contain the amount of work that we could possibly actually do as an organisation. And so what we're looking at in future is trying to look at strategies where we can look at infill to increase density.
So the second estate that we looked at was, or is the Barak Beacon public housing estate. This was undertaken through the ground lease model, so the second model of the state government renewal. Again, we were invited in by residents there to undertake this work. And again, similar findings, huge cost savings through the construction while meeting all the contemporary standards of living and energy requirements, avoiding relocation of the tenants once again, and then avoiding all those health and wellbeing issues that caused. So this Barak Beacon estate was built in the 80s. It was probably the last housing estate to be built by the state government. And similar design, it's three designs replicated throughout the estate, made out of concrete, precast concrete tilt up, and a variation of 2, 3, 4 story walk-ups. And these photos were taken this year, so good condition. And this diagram is showing you the replication of the same designs across the estate. This investigation for us has two key objectives. First of all, just looking at refurbishment, and then also looking at infill, so creating density through building houses around existing dwellings. Again, the demolition plan next to the proposed plan, and you can kind of see just quite specific demolition works, just removing joinery, windows, and then also the stairs, and then reintroducing a new circulation. So you can see a walkway on the edge, which will plug into the lift calls of the new builds, but quite minimal works. On the left is the demolition in the red, blue is proposed. So there's a reorientation of the flats currently are staggered, so you've got an internal stair. Through reorientating the flats on a single level, you can actually gain one more, which if you do across the whole estate, creates a 20% increase in dwellings as well, through just refurbishment.
Which, to note, in Victoria, the government, they do a 10% increase is what they're trying to achieve by demolition and rebuild. So by just reorientating the flats, you could double what they're actually saying they're trying to do.
Say that louder. Because your voices are going down again.
The government's ambition for increasing density is to create 10% more than the existing numbers. Through refurbishment, we can actually increase it by 20%, just purely through refurbishment.
So without any infill housing, just by reorientating existing internal.
So these are some of the views of just the refurbishment, solar cells on the roof, landscape works, but kind of minimal set of works. Internal view again, looking at passive heating and cooling systems. But again, all these flats have dual aspects and predominantly facing north as well with private balconies. So they're really well designed things. So through this, we're able to achieve an 8-star average Nathurst rating. The minimum standard is 7-star, which is what governments would achieve. A 29% reduction in energy use for the tenants that moved in. And then meeting all the livable standard upgrades as well. So better apartment standards, livable housing guidelines, and then the SDA apartments as well. And so just looking at the refurbishment, we could do the refurbishment, which includes the lift for $175,000 per dwelling, which is 19.6 million across the estate. But again, increasing the units up 25% actually. And we'll show you the numbers at the end of the infill as well.
Yeah, so as Simon mentioned, we're looking at infill in this estate as well, and that was driven by the residents, whereas at Ascot Vale, they were very anti us doing any infill, whereas Barak Beacon, they were more open to it and happy for us to take that approach. As you can sort of see, the estate is a series of row houses, so we're continuing that typology through the infill. We're also orientating all the new housing to the south east along this road, which has a lot of built up housing anyway. So making sure that northern aspect to those courtyard gardens are still there. The courtyard gardens are really great. Scale of them feels really good. So we wanted to retain those and not mess with that feeling of the space, but actually enclose it more.
And the increase in dwelling number has come from the state government. So that's what they're saying, that a site like this should be able to achieve.
Yeah.
So we're just saying that it is possible to do that while retaining the existing dwellings as well. And so this is some of the views of the proposed. So you can see the existing to the left, and then the new infill, which follows a similar typology as the existing.
Yeah, so this is looking at the infill strategy. So the infill is the piece on the left there, the existing's here. And by incorporating a lift into the infill and a new circulation gangway, we can make sure that all of the apartments can be accessed by a lift as well, which obviously they can't at the moment, through that new circulation. And again, the key driver is to make sure that we're keeping people in their homes and in their communities. So this is looking at, in the first one here, by building the new upgrade, you can then move people into the new ones. Then you can do the next part, and then by staging the works out, you can do the refurbish the entire estate without anyone having to leave.
So when you look at the cost of the infill and refurbishment, we're getting to about 280,000 per dwelling, which is 97.9 million across the estate. And what this has is huge environmental savings as well, because you're not demolishing and then creating new materials and the energy that goes into building as well. And again, we've quantified all these numbers, and through doing a strategy like this, we've estimated you could save about $88 million for the whole estate.
Again, a big part of what we're doing is advocacy work and creating a document and doing the work that allows the community there to do the advocacy work that they're interested in doing. And so Margaret's and Lena in this photo. I think Margaret was here. She's online. Hey Margaret. But allowing what they know and what we all kind of understand as being possible to prove that it is possible. And then trying to get as much media attention as possible for the estate. And then people are out on the steps of the state parliament protesting and using showing it's possible. It sort of adds weight to this protest against the eviction of Margaret being the only tenant that's left. We then also on the right presented within parliament to a range of MPs from all sides of politics as well.
Yeah, that's the next slide. Despite all of that, they are demolishing the estate. There is one tenant left in there, Margaret, who's holding tight, and there's a lot of advocacy work going around her fight as well. So they're pushing for it, but sadly the government is working its way south towards her home, demolishing the buildings. So we've looked at 2 estates. There's 14 up there, and we found in both studies that it is possible and cheaper to do so. So what's the chances that the other ones are as well? Why aren't they listening to us? I think we want to end just on the sequence of works currently doesn't allow for refurbishment, and we just want to clearly show you the process. So I'm going to have to read
that, aren't you?
read this one. So this is the current model for estate renewal in Victoria, and this is a diagram that's up on their website. And as I said before, it shows a cleared site. So these are steps that happen before the clearing of the site. So the first one is The buildings are deemed beyond repair without having conducted a feasibility study. And in the instance of Barak Beacon, 4 estates, South Yarra, Paran, Barak Beacon and Hampton East are packaged into a single tender, limiting market competition. The state government then commits a capital contribution of $260 million for the project development, market testing and procurement costs. And then 3 tenders are selected and each awarded $1 million to develop their proposal. The state government then relocates residents into much needed public housing, private rentals or property spot purchase off the market for the duration of construction, amounting to an estimated $16 million. The state government then covers the costs and risks associated with demolishing the buildings and clearing the site, and this is done prior to awarding the contract. The state government then awards a contract to the preferred tenderer, exposing themselves to the volatility of the market, having demolished their own assets. An increase of 50 community housing units will be built across the 4 estates, a total of 505 community homes and 895 private homes. So because this land is leased for 40 years to the developer, the state government will provide quarterly service payments to the developer over the 40-year lease, totaling $474 million. And so then in the year 2063, the buildings and land are handed back to the state government.
And then demolished.
So we need to rethink the sequence of delivering public housing estate renewal. And so what we're saying is the first step should be a site-specific feasibility study to see if refurbishment is viable, and including community engagement, building evaluation, design proposals, energy studies and costings. The refurbishment or demolition is accurately and publicly decided upon. And then award a building contract and advertise the proposal. And then the development should ultimately increase public housing stock. So we've obviously been invited up here, and we have been speaking to a number of architects looking at or advocating for the Waterloo estate. And we're hopefully, well, we will be going for a walk around there tomorrow, and we walked around Glebe today, and it's been a great thing seeing all this stuff. And so it's obviously a different condition slightly in Victoria, but we're very open to helping out in what capacity we can and using some of our findings and helping your advocacy as well. So yeah, the 2 reports can be found on our website, and if anyone has any questions, obviously ask them here or email us as well. We're always open to conversations. Thanks everyone.
Do you guys want to take a lead at
Yeah.
maybe Emily, Hannes, Hector, and Ian can join them if there's enough chairs?
Who's excited? I have both. So before we start the panel discussion, I'd like to ask any public housing tenants or public housing tenants who would like to share their story going through redevelopment or their current experiences with living in public housing that's about to be demolished. Would anyone like to share online as well? Give us a thumbs up if you'd like to speak. Yes.
I'm not going through a sale and I live in apartment housing. But last year, if you may recall, we had 365 days and about 300 of them rained. And so what we had was a bunch of men out front. And I thought, what's all this? What are all these men doing? So like a sticky beak, I went out to ask them, what do you guys want? They said, oh, look, we're going to put a new roof on. I said, that's intelligent. Who invented that idea in the middle of the rain? Oh, it won't rain all year, which of course it did. So they put scaffolding up for 5 months on 15 of the 16 townhouses. The safe work cover got called out 5 times for a numerous amounts of problems. And the biggest problem that I have found with apartment housing is that A, they hire substandard tradesmen. And they do the shittiest work because if they do minimal, they have a recall. And if you get a plumber come in, you'll have to recall for that. No, I can only put this washer on. And so you then have to bring up, get permission for them to put a second washer on. And the thing is, the state government does not allow for public works. So we suffer with these private enterprises who take on these tenders with the government to repair and do the shittiest, botchiest job that they can. And then we look at our properties and think, well, they're not maintained, when in fact they produce paperwork that says, oh, yeah, we can do all the time. And I know two people who come to our blocks and take a cloth and wipe over the letterboxes and sign a piece of paper, and then in the car they get. And I don't know how much money they're getting for wiping a letterbox. So we have this sort of problem where money is not spent properly. But can I just say this without you all wanting to kill me and hate my guts? I'm a homeless advocate, and I've been a homeless advocate for 21 years. 4 of those years I was homeless. Previous to that, I was a developer, and I have a lot of problems. My story is very long. So I know when I can come from a tenant, a landlord, homeowner, builder, developer's point of view. The thing is, as a homeless advocate now, I'm not just talking to people who are suffering from drugs and alcohol, mental health on the streets. I'm talking to people who had a job, had a great job, a professional job, and were living in units, in townhouses, in houses, and got evicted because they just could not afford the property they're living in, and they couldn't find another one. And so their only alternative was put all their stuff in storage and live in their car. Their job would have them back like that if they could get somewhere to live. So you look at all of this that we've seen and all the wonderful development that you want to do on Department of Housing, and then you try and pitch it to these people who are the employment of Australia, who can't find housing for themselves, and they're the ones paying for it at the end of the day. And last year, when I had a couple of years ago, when I had a conversation with a Liberal politician who I won't name, and that person had the audacity to say, how dare anybody in Department of Housing dictate to the government what they want when we provide them with a benefit, when we provide them with cheap housing, when we provide them with medical, dental, and the list went on. And that was the view of the past government. But you also have the view of people who are employed, who are paying the tax to do all these things that you want to do, and right at this very moment, half of them can't even find housing. So for me, as a tenant in Department of Housing, I'm very grateful. And I never ask help. I never ring up for a repair. I'm lucky that I can do a lot of the things myself. And I never allow housing in as much as I can as well. But I just think I'm grateful for what I have. I'm lucky for what I have. And I know farmers who have had properties that have been handed down from year after year, decades, generations, and the government have come in and said, look, we want to put a friggin' airport here and we're acquiring your land. What's the difference between someone living in Department of Housing who's been there for 30 years, who doesn't even own the property, to a farmer who does own the property and the government takes it too? Just some food for thought. I'm not trying to be the enemy. I'm just food for thought.
Anyone want to respond?
No. Yeah, I can respond. I think there's a lot. Thanks for your contribution, Kat. There's probably a lot to respond to, but a couple of things that I wanted to stress are that public housing tenants do pay tax. We all pay tax in this country, one way or another.
GST.
Exactly, precisely.
That
And
was
public
not
housing tenants
my
also
comment. That
also pay $300 million each year in rent to the Department of Housing in New South Wales, more than the funding that the government delivers to public housing. So public housing tenants, I think, they're paying plenty. They're paying their fair share, and it's really,
I just put the question.
yeah,
out.
I understand that
That's
you're
why I
playing
said
devil's
don't
advocate,
make
but I don't think we need to buy into that argument that, you know, public housing tenants, you know, don't deserve what they've got, and that they shouldn't complain if they get mistreated by the government. I think that's what we're trying to do, is foster solidarity across people who live in public housing and people who are struggling to live in the private housing market, which you're right to point out is completely dysfunctional. The solution to that is more public housing. That's why we're here today, really.
I know, I have something to add to that as well. You know, we see the government, we see the state government as people, as an organization that owns the land, owns the housing, and people who are tenants, they're renting from a landlord. But the tenants are citizens, and the government is to work for citizens. If you think of it that way, what is the role of government? To enact the will of the people, and our will as, you know, a blessed country is to take care of everyone and provide, you know, housing and shelter for everyone. So their job is to provide and maintain adequate housing. It's not for them to deem who is eligible or who deserves housing. They should be providing good housing. Yeah, let's move on to another question.
Sorry, yes, and I mean, I understand what's being said. And it's affecting everybody, just about. There's a small percentage just not. It's affecting a lot of people, and particularly the next generation of people. Okay, it was different 40 years ago. I used to work in the Housing Commission, okay, in the 80s. We were all sacked, and our job was to look at how more public housing could be built. That was our area, right? And it included other things like co-ops and so on and so forth. And some of the stuff was happening at the Northern Rivers area. Now, we were all sacked on the day the Bryan government got in. And the announcement was made then, this is 1988, by the way. The announcement was made then that the government was now moving to the market. In other words, the public sector was going to stop being involved in anything practical, and the market would solve everything. That's what's called the neoliberal period. We're now dealing with the massive consequences of that. And the ideology has been planted into people's brains. In other words, housing is not sort of something that you buy in the market. Housing is actually a human right. Food, shelter, and water. They're essential human needs. And we've somehow got ourselves into this knot of the market will solve everything. And going to some of the issues that have come up then is that Land and Housing Corporation, for instance, sorry, I'm rabbiting on with it. Land and Housing Corporation doesn't get any government money. It has to be self-funding, which is why it's demolishing and so on. And that was one of the questions I was going to ask Victorians. Have you got the same approach? In other words, they've got to, in other words, make money out of their assets, which is all the neoliberal thing. So it's spread across various states, and that's what's taken over government. And unfortunately, now we're left with public servants. Some of them are lovely people, I'm not complaining about them, but they have no idea. All they do is people work. They have no idea of the practical impacts. That's what's happening in the community. I'm not going to talk the market, I'm calling it community. Thank you.
I'm going to make a comment. I know I've had my turn, but I'm going to have another. I find what you're saying is true. But the bizarre thing about it is the whole kind of rationale of neoliberalism was that the market will deliver better results. But it's quite clear from what we heard in Victoria and what Hector told us that it's not delivering better results, and that what we need to do is return to those days of planning where we believed in the ability of the human mind to create wonderful solutions to this complexity. And, you know, I think we've got to kind of be pushing that message. We've got a new government and they need to do things in a new way.
And return to public service.
Yes.
I'll take your question. Two questions in the audience, but did you want to respond? I think there was a question in there about how funding is different in Victoria versus New South Wales.
I think it's the same. Yeah.
Well, you made it sound worse.
Oh, I think it's worse.
I think it's worse.
Yeah, we're a few years ahead of maybe what's coming to you guys. But I think that's where we were getting with the uncaptured costs, that there are costs that the government is having to pay, especially the relocation costs that's coming out of someone's budget. that could be better directed towards some of this refurbishment work. And that they should be thought about in the total budget of these construction projects.
The whole model has to be shifted, changed.
Absolutely.
We have a question from online. We've got a question.
Two in the audience first. Okay.
Cool. I think that gentleman was first to raise his hand, and then lady in the back. You want to go first?
Me,
Oh no, that lady. Oh, sorry. The man in the pink. Dustin.
who are you pointing to?
Kristen? No,
There was other hands up before me, actually.
no, Tristan.
Get
on.
In your talk of retain and blah, 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 you talked about circulation. I was just wondering, circulation from ventilation or circulation as a easement of movement through the place? By the term circulation.
Movement.
And the other thing I want to say is the previous government's maintenance record is awful. They actually do not audit what is done. It took me over a year and a half going to NAB meetings, finding out who the mysterious lank person, only one in Sydney or the whole state, and blah, blah. I eventually got the roof gutters fixed, and I've got in writing leaf gutters and, replacing the gutters and replacing the leaf covered protectors. They did not put the protectors back on. And that now the same foreman is working in another house nearby, and he's an obnoxious thief. And who's checking? And that previous house was empty from 2016. Same government, the same company before, during COVID, were sending cleaners to go in and clean an uninhabitable house. And they left their cool log sheets at the front of the house. I took pictures of everything, sent it to the Lanks person, who I did get the contact through going to numerous NAB meetings, and never heard anything, no response, nothing. It just continued, and now it's getting renovated. But we've got a property that was empty too. Row of townhouses emptied more than 2 months or so ago, and they haven't even come in and cleaned, and there's not going to do much to make it habitable, for example. So, and then this place that's just almost getting fixed, when are they going to put someone in? So there's no auditing, and the contractors think they can just walk in through any multiple exits. We're not actually part of this house behind us that's getting renovated, but they come in, they open up everything, they leave rubbish everywhere, and then they tell you off if you dare go and ask questions. What are they doing? And say, this is the worker, you must leave, and won't discuss nothing. We're not told anything. I'm just saying it's appalling, but what is Labor now doing to fix that? They're not, they're carrying on like not the same. And they're going to continue. And the other point is the massive immigration that we've had since 2000, which is continuing under Labor government, when we already have a critical housing shortage, and it's going to exacerbate, make it worse. And yet no one's really questioning that.
I might pass this to the
and
speakers.
Without being racist or about immigrants, I have no problem, but when you bring massive numbers in, when the locals are not being housed, it's a problem.
Half of the building workers, we need to do this project. So where are we going to get our building workers from? That's from the immigration.
Yeah, but underway, no audits. No.
I think your point on the maintenance, the lack of maintenance, your point on that's exactly what was happening to a lot of these estates in Melbourne. They weren't maintaining it and they were falling apart. So the only way to do it was demolish. And so that gave it just covered their story of why these properties need to be demolished, basically. So the lack of maintenance actually
built-in obsoleteness. Demolition by neglect.
Exactly.
And also built-in obsoleteness.
I guess more to Stephen and Simon, but everyone in the panel. Have you noticed a change in public policy or government attitude since the change of government at federal and state
Well,
level?
no, I haven't.
The minister has said in relation to Glebe, there were a number of old houses, Victorian houses, which were public housing, which had been put on the market before the election. They were withdrawn, they were taken off the market by the new government. And Eveleigh,
Yes.
there are some
refurbishing.
statements that they're not going to sell them, but
Yeah, that, and they've got notices on them to say, you know, enter only with a hard hat. So presumably they're being refurbished.
so that is a slight positive.
Yes.
There's a question in the second row.
Hi, my name is Serena. I live in Explorer Street, Eveleigh, which is marked for demolition. And at the moment, they're trying to rezone. As a tenant, my concern is, like we talk about, not repairing and things like that. I'd like to maintain the area, and everybody, the 46 houses that are in my little enclave, everyone's the same. We're 100% occupied, and we all have been there for 30 years. They were only built in 1991. So they're talking about demolishing these things and building something else quite ugly, like 3 18-story high rises in their place. To block out all the local owners that own all their own properties, and it will change the whole feel for the area. I've had issues with repairs, and when you talk about how the government doesn't repair anything, I've had more than 10 years. 2013, I had a leak through my roof. Now they've taken the electricity out, and I have a little battery light to go to the bathroom, and I have to take an umbrella with me when it rains. And that's 10 years. The last time I rang, which was about a month ago, it said, look, it's raining, can you send somebody to repair the roof? And it's raining again. They sent a plumber, and I said to the plumber when I opened the door, what are you here for? And he goes, to fix your roof. And I says, and you are? He goes, I'm a plumber. I says, I haven't got an effing toilet on top of my roof. Oh, roofing plumbers, but honestly, I know it's really turned up my house. But anyway, what my concern is, I'm really thankful for tonight, and I love all the stories and everything you've shared, and it's given me a lot more hope. But I'm at the stage where I feel, as a small housing person, you know, thanks Albo, former housing, I'm Serena, current housing, you know, do something serious. Teach them how to look at the community that we are, the family that we are. We are there to do more for our areas, not take them down. Remember, we are people. So for me, it's want to be a good.
You want to respond or move on? I think it's been waiting for a while.
I guess this is mainly to Office, but also to everyone else. You spoke a lot in your talk about the feasibility, and well done on getting a quantity surveyor and doing all of that. I don't know how you managed to do that on a not-for-profit budget, but congratulations. And you did effectively a feasibility study, and you showed that the government would save all this money by following your plan for Barak Beacon. And then you went and spoke to the government and explained all of this to them, just like you explained it to us tonight. And it's all so incredibly obvious, and they still demolished it. Why do you think that the economics of it is central when you've presented the economics and you haven't been listened to?
Yeah.
Do you want to handle that? No, I think I don't think it's only an economic reason why the Labor government in Victoria and Labor governments are neoliberal. They want to sell off public housing. So the public housing estates in Melbourne that are being demolished are then being privatised in different ways. So we saw the estate that we looked at today is being demolished and rebuilt as public housing. That does not happen in Victoria. They do not build new public housing. It's only community housing, which is private, not-for-profit housing. So that is what they want to do. They don't want to have to deal with public housing tenants, essentially. So saying we can only put forward our argument on their terms, basically, because that they're saying there's an economic, they need to increase density, all those sort of things. So we can show all those things are possible, but they don't openly say that we want to get rid of all public housing tenants, which is essentially what as far as we can tell, the goal is. I think that the hope is in that that it is improving, as we said, like the first iteration of the public housing renewal program was really bad, and the ground lease model is slightly better, and hopefully we can continue to push and help the housing advocates to do their work and show that it is possible. So I think that, yeah, the reasoning isn't necessarily only economic. There's also obviously really strong political reasons. So it's navigating through that's a challenge.
Yeah, I want to add that the estates in Glebe, yes, we've got a commitment that there'll be public housing, but we suspect that they will be privatised, i.e. under community housing.
Yeah, okay.
Thing, but they've said that they're going to be public housing, but I wouldn't trust that for a second.
Yeah.
I think we have a couple of comments online.
Yeah, so Lorna Munro is online and has made a question, possibly a comment. Has anyone had a visit from a client service officer, anyone in public housing that is? Supposedly it's meant to happen yearly, but I've lived in public housing all my life and this is the first time for me. So I think that kind of speaks to another form of neglect of public housing.
They don't give warning.
Services. Yeah.
They don't give warning. They turn up and leave a note saying, "Oh, we came and went." Yeah.
And they only
books. They say they've done the job.
Yeah, they only want to inspect the fire alarms because otherwise, you know, like they'll get so. So that's all they inspect is the fire alarms.
Yes.
And then they walk out.
Yeah. Another comment, sorry, just wrapping up a couple online. So Lorna also says that she was recently told that there are no homes available in Glebe, so she thought that was interesting.
Oh, there are two empties right next to me.
And I also just wanted to repeat a comment from Alicia, who's involved in the Safe Barak Reading campaign and is asking folks to add their name to a joint statement in solidarity with that campaign, which you'll find at safe-barak-beacon .mailchimp.sites.com/joint statement. You can hopefully see it on here. If that's difficult, you all to remember.
You definitely
or
can.
email them safe-barak-beacon@gmail.com.
Question there first. The gentleman in the white hat, yep.
One last final thing before you all hate my guts is I got invited to a homeless forum, and the speaker of the forum pointed down to me and said, "Where are we going to get all this public housing that you want for your homeless?" And I said, "Thank you very much." So I jumped up on stage, got the other microphone, and said, "For all of you who remember the Sydney Opera House lottery," and a lot of people stood and thought, "Yeah, we remember that." And I said, that Sydney Opera House lottery was created to finish building the Sydney Opera House by 1973 because the Queen was invited to come out and open that opera house. That same opera house lottery did not cease until 1986, and in that 13-year period we had more growth and building of public housing ever in Australia. So when I asked, why couldn't we have a housing lottery, I went and did an environmental survey and everybody was on board with it, 100%. I had no failures. And when I presented that to the government, that was the last government, not the present one, they just ignored it.
We're gonna have to keep moving with there's a lot more questions. Lady in the back, yes.
I'm not a tenant, but I used to live next to Franklin Street housing, and then now I live near Serena. So I suppose that as a young person who doesn't live in housing but is very passionate about supporting the community, I first saw the signs in the houses next to mine and have followed the journey from there over to Waterloo and over to Henson Road now. And I guess my question for the panel, since it's the panel, I'm going to be asking questions, is what has your experience been in engaging the wider community? Because as a young person who uses a lot of social media, that's how I talk to a lot of my friends about these causes, to actually try and get the general community who is now, facing housing problems themselves a lot for the first time. How do we actually engage our wider community and the people we talk to every day? And what's your experience has been in that, successes, failures, or your advice as community members who who want to be here and encourage other people to be here whilst I think.
I'm going to answer very quickly and shortly.
We'll just repeat that for Zoom if you don't mind, Eddie.
Yeah, so the question was how, in your experiences, how do you approach gathering community support, greater public support, and inviting others who may not live in public housing to join your cause?
The Glebe Society has 400 members, and we have some members in public housing, but not very many. But overall, the society is supportive of public housing in Glebe and is opposed to the sale of the 19th century houses because we value the fact that we are a broad social demographic, and we find Glebe is like a country town. You know, in a country town, you have every part of society, and it makes it a wonderful place to live because people are very friendly. So, and I'm not sure that other parts of Sydney understand that, but I think it's a very important message to get across that diverse communities are nicer places to live.
We'll take a couple more questions. I'm just worrying of the time. So 1, Karen, and 2 and 3 in the back. So Karen.
Okay, this is for Simon and Stephen. Technical, I guess. In the ground lease model that you showed where they start with a little picture of their land, and you put in all those other ones, where do you find that information? That's what I want to know.
Yeah.
I need to find out what they're doing in Waterloo.
Yeah, so we had a researcher help us out, Miriam, who trawled a lot of budgets, state budgets to find hidden figures.
Yeah.
And then we obviously had the economists to quantify some of those costs as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, in our report, it's all linked to where we found that information. So
yeah.
And get in touch as well.
Yeah.
I've read most of the report, most of this.
That's the appendices.
Oh, yeah, look, first of all, I think we should congratulate all the activists and the residents who've been campaigning for so long for public housing, and we're finally getting a little bit of a result we're seeing in Glebe. And my first question is perhaps in Melbourne, what sort of support and what sort of campaign has been going on? I'm a little bit astounded, to be truthful, that the Andrews government has got away with a program of demolishing large-scale public housing, and I haven't heard here in Sydney of what sort of social movement has developed against that. So that was the one question for Melbourne, and the other one is from Hector and Ian and Emily. With this eminently reasonable proposal that you put up to save money and not demolish Wentworth Park Avenue, and I've been there. I actually joined in the occupation and saw a rather nice film there one night. Anyway, they had a wonderful occupation. What response has there been to this eminently reasonable proposal to, instead of knocking it down, build out the back with very, solid housing and so on? Yeah, I just wonder if there's been any progress.
Well, the Minister hasn't replied to the Glebe Society's letter at all.
It is coming up to City Council.
It is. The problem with it, a DA was lodged by the previous government just before the election. At our request, we outlined to the Minister the rationale, and we sent a copy of Hector's scheme, and we listed all the things that you've heard tonight. And we requested that the DA be deferred until all these options had been properly considered. And we have to get our skates on and do more work. It's imperative because it's a Crown application, although it's been lodged before the City Council, because it's a Crown application, the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act has some words in it about Crown applications. And I think it's very difficult for a local planning panel, no matter how unreasonable the application is, if it comes from the government, to refuse it. So it's really imperative. It's set down for the 30th of August at the moment to a local planning panel, but it is imperative to get the alternatives out into the public domain as widely as possible, because I think the clincher for the argument is that it is better and cheaper. Now, how do you argue with that? How do you say, oh, well, we'd like something that's more expensive and worse?
Yeah, I guess my question was also to Melbourne, and congratulations to Hands Off Glebe and also Action for Public Housing for fighting so hard and winning on Franklin Street. I really do think you really. And yeah, we just can't keep our eye off the prizes, which is 82 Wentworth and then Waterloo. But also it's South Eveleigh and now Ascot, and we think it's going to be Riverwood, Coffs, Harbour, because the Labor Party are basically following carte blanche from the Liberal Party, except for Franklin Street and hopefully those 30 terraces. But yeah, I was also involved in the occupation of 82 Wentworth Park Road on it, and on day 2, Rose Jackson came out with a tweet saying, overriding the DA application process and saying 100% public housing build at 82 Wentworth Park. It showed we had all this support, all this media, 200 people in the occupation at any one point in time. But it did show the level of support that we had, and also that the Labor Party is quite on the nose here in New South Wales. They promised not to privatise, they lied, it's pretty clear. And you know, Caroline and the tenants were very clear on no demolition, just a rebuild. I guess my question is, there's 444 public dwellings demolished in Victoria, as according to the last article that I read, with like 5 major estates just hammered. And we're looking down that gun here. So, you know, that's the point, I guess, that Jim's made. Where is this movement at? You know, are the unions on side in Victoria and so on? And I guess it's incumbent on us to make that relationship between Victoria and New South Wales a lot firmer to defend and extend public housing. So yeah, and I guess the question to the Glebe crew is, yeah, our next steps, we've got to think about that for 82 Wentworth. That's it.
I guess is the question how has this happened in Victoria? I guess is kind of underlying in that question. I mean, it has been happening for, when was Carlton done? 20.
Yeah, so even prior to the public housing renewal program, there's estate demolition.
It's been decades of this has been happening in Victoria, I guess, would be the depressing answer to that. I think now we're starting to see, and like Alicia, who commented in there, who's working on the Save Barak Beacon campaign, doing great work. And I think that we're starting to get that support. And I think, as you mentioned, that more broadly, people that are in housing stress, I think it makes it easier for, unfortunately, that's making it easier for people to understand that the step between most people and being in public housing or being homeless is smaller than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. So I think that is making it, the reality is a bit more forward. And I think that they're working with, with Rahu and a range of other unions and organisers there. I think that the Barak Beacon estate, because Margaret's such a good advocate, the resident there, has really shone a light on what's happening, which has been, obviously it's pretty horrible what's happening to her and what's happening there, but I think that's been a really valuable thing, and the amount of media attention she's been getting and that campaign's been getting that they've been running has been encouraging, even if it's not working. And I think that we're all aware that, what's coming there, and hopefully we can aim for some better outcomes in the future. Yeah, that's
I think educating the broader public what's going on. So that program was the public housing renewal program, and there's no public housing that was being renewed. It was all under the social housing umbrella. So I think educating the public what actually is happening, what social housing means, what community housing means, and making people aware what is actually going on is really important as well. And that's starting to happen in Melbourne, I think.
Yeah. And we see like, well, we're designers, we're not community organisers, or like we've got a certain set of skills that we can use, and we can support people who are on the ground, who are at Barak Beacon occupying those estates, who are doing that work. And just being aware of what skills we have as designers, and giving people the tools, and again the facts that they can argue those points with people, and it supports those on the ground campaigns as much as we can. But there's people who are a lot better at community organising than we are, so we leave that to them.
Any comments from Hands Off Glebe? No, we might start and wrap it up. Obviously, continued action is the most important, so I'll invite Alistair from Action for Public Housing to talk about next steps in
Yeah,
action.
thanks, Eddie. I first of all want to thank all of our speakers again who have been brilliant tonight. Done a wonderful job. Redfern Community Centre staff who stayed here late. I'm not sure if they can hear us, but and I'm looking particularly those that didn't stuck it out for nearly 2.5 hours now. Thanks so much for your time tonight. It's been mentioned already. I think particularly Serena mentioned it. You know, we know what the alternatives are. We know we have better solutions to what the government is proposing in New South Wales and Victoria, but what we need is to build the political power and momentum to realise those alternatives. So to that end, I really want to encourage everybody to come to the next Action for Public Housing meeting Monday night next week at 5:30 p.m. on Zoom and at the factory in Waterloo, that's 67 Raglan Street. So 5:30 next Monday. We meet every month to discuss these campaigns. We really need your help to get behind saving 82 Wentworth Park Road, realising this alternative proposal that Hector has so generously put together, but also preparing, continuing the fight for Waterloo South, preparing the fight for Explorer Street in South Eveleigh. Rachel also mentioned Ascot. There are public housing developments all over New South Wales that are under threat. The New South Wales government, the new New South Wales government hasn't really changed much at all. And as we can see from Victoria, and thanks again to Simon and Steve, that, you know, the Labor Party in government in Victoria is largely doing what the Liberal or coalition government did here, if not worse. So we need to build power outside of those political parties, outside of elections, in our communities. Thanks to the question as well about how we connect with people outside of public housing in those wider communities. That's really what we want to do. So please get involved. We've got sign-up sheets, QR codes on all of the tables as you exit. There's also another QR code that you can use to donate to Action for Public Housing to help us bring office back to Sydney to continue that relationship, as well as our other campaigns which do require money, unfortunately. But yeah, the fight to retain, repair and reinvest in public housing is really what we're all about. So please get involved within your own individual capacity, and if you also can do so financially. So thanks everybody. I think that's a wrap.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you sit for your leisure?